Don't worry, Dad. The rocks will keep you company, my son whispered as he pushed the final boulder across the cave entrance. Daylight vanished. Then his footsteps faded, and I heard him call 911 with a shaking voice, pretending he had just watched me die. But he made one mistake. Deep inside that mountain, someone had already heard the explosion, and he knew exactly how to get out. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to Dad's Revenge Stories. I'd love to know where you are watching from today. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. Please note this story blends fictional elements for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to names or settings is coincidental, but the message conveyed is vital. The cold came back before anything else did. Not the sharp, biting cold of a winter morning, but something deeper and more patient, the kind that works its way through clothing and skin and settles into the bone like it has always belonged there. I became aware of it slowly, the way you become aware of a sound that has been playing for a long time before you finally hear it. My fingers registered it first, then my shoulders, then the hard, uneven surface pressed against my back. I opened my eyes to nothing. Not darkness the way a dark room is dark, where your eyes adjust and shapes begin to form. This was the other kind. Complete. Absolute. The kind that makes you press your fingers against your eyelids just to confirm they are open. They were open. I lay still for a moment, breathing carefully, running an inventory of myself, the way I had been trained to do in the field decades ago. Head, shoulders, ribs. I stopped at the ribs. Something there was not right, a deep radiating ache that sharpened when I drew a full breath. Not broken, I decided. Bruised badly, but not broken. I had broken ribs once back in '94 on a survey trip in Nevada, and that had been a different kind of pain, entirely bright and insistent and impossible to argue with. This was manageable. My left hand found the side of my face. A cut above my temple dried now. Not bleeding. My legs moved when I asked them to. I pushed myself upright slowly, one hand against the cave floor for balance, and the world tilted for a moment before it settled. My head throbbed in a low, steady rhythm. I sat with my back against the cave wall and waited for it to ease. The flashlight. I remembered the flashlight. My right hand found my jacket pocket, and the small, heavy cylinder was still there. I clicked it on, and the beam cut across the dark like something alive. I squinted against it, then turned it toward the ceiling, letting the light diffuse, and breathed out slowly at what I saw. The entrance was gone. Not collapsed in the way that rock sometimes shifts and settles naturally, leaving gaps, leaving possibility. This was deliberate. The opening I had walked through, the low, wide mouth of the cave I had marked on my survey map 5 years ago, was now a solid wall of granite and limestone rising from floor to ceiling. The pieces were large, intentional, stacked with a purpose that no rockslide had ever demonstrated in 41 years of my fieldwork. I pressed my lips together and held the beam steady. A scientist looks at evidence. He does not flinch from what the evidence tells him. He records it, catalogs it, and draws the conclusion that the facts demand not the one he would prefer. The facts were these. Someone had sealed this entrance from the outside. The rock placement was too uniform for a natural collapse. The material was consistent with the exterior granite formation above the cave mouth, not the interior limestone that surrounded me now. And the smell, still faintly present in the cool, still air, was something sharp and chemical, something that did not belong underground and did not belong to anything natural. Julian had planned this. The thought did not arrive with the shock I might have expected. It arrived quietly, the way a difficult answer arrives at the end of a long calculation, almost gentle in its finality. I had been running the numbers since I hit the ledge. since I heard the sound that followed, since I found myself here instead of anywhere else? The answer had been assembling itself piece by piece, and now it was simply complete. My son had planned this. I turned the beam toward my backpack, which had somehow remained strapped across my shoulders through the fall. The left strap had torn at the seam, and the pack hung awkwardly, but it was there. I worked it off carefully, mindful of my ribs, and set it on the cave floor in front of me. The samples were inside. I unzipped the main compartment and found them where I had packed them. Each specimen sealed in its labeled bag. Each bag nested in the foam-lined case I had carried into the field for the better part of 2 decades. The labels were in my handwriting. Date, location, depth, mineral classification. Every coordinate I had spent 5 years narrowing down to this single site. I zipped the case closed and held it in my lap. Eleanor would have called this stubbornness, the fact that my first coherent thought after waking alone in a sealed cave was concern for my rock samples. She would have said it with that particular expression of hers, the one that was equal parts exasperation and affection, and she would not have been entirely wrong. But these were not just samples. They were the record of something real, something I had found and documented and could prove. And whatever Julian intended, he had not taken them. That mattered. I was not yet sure how, but it mattered. I ran the flashlight beam along the walls around me, slow and methodical, the way you sweep a site when you are looking for something you have not yet identified. The cave widened behind me. The ceiling rose. There were formations along the far wall, mineral deposits I recognized from my surveys, the same dark veins that had first told me this site was worth pursuing years ago. The floor sloped gently downward toward the back of the chamber, and from somewhere in that direction, steady and rhythmic, came the sound of water. Dripping, not running. Patient, not urgent, but present. Water meant a passage. A passage meant movement. Movement meant possibility. I got to my feet carefully, one hand against the wall, and stood until the dizziness passed. My body protested in several specific locations. I noted each one and set it aside. Then I picked up my backpack, clicked the flashlight to its wider beam, and began to walk toward the sound. The floor was uneven, and I moved slowly, checking each step before I committed my weight. The chamber narrowed as it went deeper, the walls pressing closer, the ceiling dropping. The mineral deposits grew denser here, the veins I had been tracking for years running thick and dark through the limestone like handwriting in a language I had spent my career learning to read. The dripping grew louder. I rounded a natural curve in the passage, and the beam caught something I had not expected. A shelf of rock jutting out from the left wall at roughly waist height, dry and flat, wide enough to serve as a surface. On it, arranged with a tidiness that the cave itself could not have managed, sat a tin cup, a folded piece of cloth, and the stub of a candle burned down to its last inch. I stopped walking. I held the beam on those 3 objects for a long moment. The cup was not mine. The cloth was not mine. The candle was not mine. Somewhere behind me, from the direction of the sealed entrance, a sound reached me through the rock. Low, rhythmic. The particular sound of boots on stone moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were going. I clicked off the flashlight. In the darkness, I pressed my back against the cave wall and stopped breathing. The footsteps stopped. I pressed harder against the wall, my ribs screaming at the pressure, and held every muscle still. The darkness around me was total. Whoever was out there had no advantage over me in that regard. We were equal in the blind. Then a light appeared around the curve of the passage, not the sharp white beam of a modern flashlight. Something older and warmer, the amber glow of a lantern carried at arm's length, throwing soft, uneven light across the cave walls. The light moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who had walked this path many times before. I stayed where I was. The figure came around the bend and stopped the moment the lantern reached me. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, with a beard that had grown well past any deliberate choice, and eyes that caught the lamplight and held it. He wore canvas and denim worn to softness and heavy boots caked with the particular pale mud of this cave system. At his belt, a folding tool of some kind. Nothing threatening in the way he held himself, but nothing relaxed either. We looked at each other across 8 feet of cave floor. He spoke first. His voice was low and even, the voice of a man who had not used it much lately but had not forgotten how. "You're not supposed to be in here." "Neither are you," I said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. "Fair enough." He set the lantern on a natural ledge in the wall and raised both hands, briefly, palms out, the universal gesture of a man demonstrating he means no harm. "My name is Silas. I've been living in this cave system for going on 3 years. I heard something earlier that I didn't like the sound of, so I came to check." "The collapse," I said, "among other things." His eyes moved over me with the quick, practiced assessment of someone trained to evaluate injuries. "You're hurt." "I'm functional." "That's not what I asked." He took a step closer and I held my ground, and he stopped. "I'm not going to hurt you. If I wanted to do that, I'd have let you keep wandering toward the lower passage. There's a 12-foot drop about 40 yards that direction that you would not have enjoyed finding in the dark." I breathed out slowly. "Arthur Vance." "I know who you are," Silas said. "I've seen your survey markers in the upper chambers. Red flagging tape date stamps your initials." He paused. "You found something significant up here?" "Yes." "And someone didn't want you to walk back out with it." The word "yes" formed in my chest, but what came out instead was something I had not planned to say. "My son." My voice held steady. I was proud of that. "The man who sealed the entrance is my son." Silas did not react with the shock most people would have offered. He simply absorbed it the way experienced people absorb bad news without performance. Then he crouched beside the lantern and looked up at me. "Sit down, Mr. Vance, before you fall down." I sat. He moved to his pack and produced a cloth which he handed across without ceremony. Then he studied my face with the careful attention of a man who knew what he was looking for. "Your responses are slower than they should be," he said. "Given what you've been through, that could be the fall. But your eyes are tracking fine, so it's probably not concussion alone." He paused. "Did you drink anything before you came into the cave water? Anything your son gave you?" I thought of the canteen. Julian handing it to me on the trail, already uncapped, already open. The easy, familiar gesture of a son handing his father a drink of water. The chill that moved through me then had nothing to do with the temperature of the cave. "Yes," I said. Silas nodded once slowly, as though I had confirmed something he had already suspected. "There are compounds that slow the central nervous system without putting a person fully under. Low doses, hard to taste. They reduce reaction time, impair coordination." He met my eyes directly. "In a situation where someone needed you to respond slowly and not fight back effectively, that would be useful." I sat with that for a moment. The lantern flame moved in some slight current of air I could not feel. "You were a paramedic," I said, "or a rescue worker, something like that." "Search and rescue," he said. 12 years, team leader for the last 4. He looked at the cave wall rather than at me. "I left that work a while back." I did not ask why. The way he said it closed the door on further questions, and I had spent enough years in academic settings to recognize when a subject was finished. "You said there's another way out," I said. "There is," He stood, picked up the lantern. It's not easy, and it's not fast, but it connects to a drainage system that runs to the base of the range. He looked at me with the frank assessment of a man calculating variables. Can you walk? I got to my feet and stood without swaying. Good enough, Silas said. Then we should move. The air quality near that sealed entrance is going to drop by morning, and I'd rather not be here when it does. He turned and started back the way he had come, lifting the lantern to light the path. I picked up my backpack, settled it across my shoulders, and followed the man I had known for 4 minutes deeper into the mountain. The passage opened without warning. One moment the walls were close enough to touch with both hands, and the next they simply fell away, and I stepped into a chamber that stopped me where I stood. It was not large by any geological standard. Maybe 30 feet across, 20 deep, with a ceiling that arched naturally to a point 15 feet overhead, where a thin crack ran the length of the rock and breathed a thread of cool outside air down into the space below. But what filled it was not geology. What filled it was evidence of a life carefully and deliberately constructed in a place where no life was supposed to exist. Shelves made from driftwood and flat stones lined the left wall, stocked with canned goods, arranged by size batteries, sorted into groups. Coils of rope hung on iron spikes driven into the rock. A sleeping bag, thick and well-maintained, was rolled into a corner on a raised platform of smooth stone. At the center of the chamber, a fire pit had been built with the precision of an engineer, ringed with rocks chosen for their flatness and surrounded by a low clay wall on 3 sides. Directly above it, the ceiling crack widened into a natural flue, and the air above the pit was clean and clear. Silas set the lantern on a flat rock and crouched beside the fire pit with the ease of long habit. He had a fire going in under 2 minutes, the movements practiced, and economical, the kind of efficiency that comes not from speed, but from having done something so many times that thought is no longer required. Sit anywhere, he said without looking up. I sat on a low rock near the fire and looked around the chamber. On the right wall, covering nearly the entire surface from floor to shoulder height, was a map. Not a printed map, not anything produced by a cartography office or a geological survey team. A hand-drawn map rendered in pencil and charcoal and what appeared to be a rust-colored mineral pigment, covering dozens of sheets of paper that had been fixed to the rock with a substance I could not immediately identify. It showed the cave system in extraordinary detail, passages and chambers and elevation changes marked with notations in a small, precise hand. I stared at it for a long moment. You drew all of that? I said. Over 3 years, yes. Silas set a dented pot on the grate above the fire and poured water into it from a sealed container. I had time. That is a more complete survey of this system than anything in the academic literature. I know. He glanced at the map with an expression I could not read. I found your markers in the upper chambers about 8 months ago. Red tape, your initials, your institution's survey codes. I knew someone serious had been working the surface above me. The water began to move in the pot. He added dried herbs from a cloth pouch, and the smell that rose with the steam was something green and faintly medicinal, not unpleasant. How long have you been supplying this place? I asked. I go down to the nearest town every 6 or 8 weeks. Night trips, cash only. He handed me a tin cup and poured without ceremony. I don't interact with people if I can help it. I wrapped both hands around the cup and felt the warmth move into my fingers. Why? Silas sat back on his heels and looked at the fire rather than at me. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of a man deciding how much of a truth to give to a stranger. I lost people, he said finally. People I was supposed to keep safe. After that, being around the living felt like a particular kind of cruelty. He picked up his own cup. The mountain doesn't ask anything of you. It doesn't look at you like you owe it something. I thought about Julian at the kitchen table 3 weeks ago, leaning over the map with that careful, neutral expression I had mistaken for interest. I thought about the way he had asked questions, specific questions, about coordinates and access points and survey schedules. I had answered every one of them. You said earlier that whoever did this didn't start planning yesterday. I said, I did. What made you say that? Silas looked at me across the fire. Because of what I found when I went to check the entrance after the collapse. The material used to seal it, the method, the placement. That takes preparation. You don't gather what was needed in an afternoon. He paused. Whoever did this had been thinking about it for a while. Long enough to know exactly what they needed and where to get it. The fire crackled between us. Outside the chamber, the cave was perfectly silent. My son works in marketing, I said. The words came out flat and strange, the way words do when they no longer mean what they used to mean. He handles investor relations, corporate presentations. He is very good at making people believe what he needs them to believe. Silas said nothing, and the quality of his silence was different from before. It was the silence of a man who understood exactly what I was telling him without needing it explained. Tell me about the discovery, he said quietly. The one that brought you up here. So I told him. The mineral vein, the survey data, the conservative estimates that still ran into figures that made my colleagues go quiet when they heard them. I told him about showing Julian the map, about the expression on my son's face that I had read as pride and was now reading as something else entirely. Silas listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he stood and walked to the hand-drawn map on the wall. He placed one finger on a point near the center of the system and looked back at me. The vein you found, he said. It runs directly beneath this chamber. Neither of us spoke for a long time after that. Silas sat back down across the fire from me, and we both looked at the map on the wall, at the point his finger had touched, at the convergence of geological fact and human calculation that had put me at the bottom of a mountain, with my ribs taped and my son somewhere above me preparing his story for the morning news. He knew, I said. It was not a question. He knew exactly where you would go, Silas said. The vein runs northeast through the lower chambers. If you had gone looking for a way out on your own, you would have followed the mineral deposit deeper in. That passage dead ends at a rockfall about 200 yards back. He paused. It's not a survivable situation, not without knowing the system. I set my cup down on the cave floor. 41 years of field work. 41 years of reading the earth, of understanding how things were buried, and why and what it meant when you found them. I had built an entire career on the premise that patience and observation could reveal what was hidden. And my own son had used that knowledge against me with a precision that still made my chest tighten when I fully considered it. He studied my surveys, I said. He would have had access to everything in my office. Field notes, topographic, overlays, the hydrological data. I looked at Silas. I never locked anything. He was my son. It never occurred to me to lock anything. Silas fed a short length of wood into the fire and watched the flame take it. Tell me about him. Before all of this, the question surprised me. Most people confronted with a situation like this one wanted facts and logistics and next steps. Silas was asking me something different. Julian was a quiet child, I said slowly. Careful. He watched everything before he participated in it. Eleanor used to say he came out of the womb already taking notes. The memory arrived with the particular ache that all good memories carry, now that thin edge of pain underneath the warmth. When she died, he was 12. I thought I handled it well. I thought I gave him what he needed. I stopped. I gave him what I knew how to give, which was mostly time in the field and a good education and the understanding that hard work produces results. That's not nothing, Silas said. No, but it turns out it was not everything either. The fire moved between us, and somewhere deeper in the cave the water dripped its slow, indifferent count. You lost people too, I said. You mentioned it earlier, that you left rescue work. Silas was quiet for long enough that I thought he might not answer. His hands rested on his knees, and he looked at the fire with the focused attention of a man using it as a fixed point. My wife's name was Clara, he said at last. His voice was level, but the levelness was the kind that is achieved and maintained, not the kind that comes naturally. Our daughter was Sophie. She was 9 years old, and she was afraid of nothing on this earth. He almost smiled at that. Almost. We were on a hiking trip in the Cascades, a section of trail we had done before, a trail I had personally assessed for safety as part of my work. He stopped. The ground gave way. It was a geological event, not a weather event. No warning signs that any standard assessment protocol would have flagged. His jaw tightened. I was 20 feet ahead of them. I turned around when I heard Sophie call my name, and by the time I reached where they had been standing, there was nothing to reach. The word nothing landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. I felt the ripples of it. Silas, I said. I dug for 4 hours, he said. I broke 3 fingers on my right hand, and I did not notice until the next morning. I found Clara's bracelet first, then Sophie's jacket. He looked up from the fire and met my eyes directly, and what I saw in his face was not grief exactly, but something past grief and something that has been lived with so long, it has become part of the landscape. After that, I could not be around rescue work anymore. I could not be the person who told other people their family was gone. I had no authority left for that conversation. I did not offer condolences. They would have been inadequate, and we both would have known it. Instead, I said, "How long have you been down here?" 3 years in February. And it helps. He considered the question seriously, the way he seemed to consider most things. It stopped making it worse, he said. That was enough for a long time. He reached into the front pocket of his canvas jacket and produced a bracelet, simple leather cord with a small carved wooden piece at the center, smoothed by years of handling. He turned it over in his fingers once, then held it out toward me across the fire. "Clara's," he said. "I want you to take it tomorrow." I looked at it without taking it. "I can't take that. You're not keeping it. I'm lending it." His voice was matter of fact, the voice of a man explaining a practical arrangement. "There is a passage tomorrow morning that is going to be the hardest thing you have done in a very long time. 15 feet horizontal, and at the narrowest point, the ceiling will be 4 inches above your face." He watched me. Most people discover things about themselves in tight spaces that they would prefer not to know. If that happens, I need you to hold on to something real instead of the inside of your own head. I looked at the bracelet in his outstretched hand. The wood at the center was pale and worn to a shine. "What did Clara think of the mountains?" I asked. For the first time since I had met him, something genuinely warm moved across Silas's face. "She thought they were the most honest things in the world," he said. "She said they never pretended to be smaller than they were." I reached across the fire and took the bracelet. "Get some sleep, Mr. Vance," Silas said, standing and moving toward his sleeping area. "We leave at first light, and tomorrow is going to ask everything you have." I looked at the bracelet in my palm, then at the fire burning low, then at the map on the wall with its careful lines tracing the hidden world beneath the world. I did not sleep for a long time. Silas woke me at 4 in the morning, or what he estimated to be 4, based on the particular quality of the air moving through the ceiling crack above the fire pit. There was no dawn underground. There was only the shift from one kind of dark to another, and the moment when Silas's lantern came back to life and the chamber stopped being a place of rest and became a place of departure. I had slept perhaps 2 hours. My ribs had stiffened overnight, and getting upright required a specific sequence of movements that I worked out slowly, one hand braced against the cave wall, jaw set against the protest of muscles that had taken more than they were accustomed to. Silas watched without commenting, which I appreciated more than I could have expressed. He had packed everything with the efficiency of a man who had broken camp many times in difficult conditions. 2 cans of food, sealed water containers, a compact first aid kit, spare batteries, a coil of rope, and the folded tarp I had noticed the night before, all distributed between the 2 packs, with a logic I recognized as the logic of weight distribution on a long carry. "Eat something before we go," he said, handing me a tin of beans opened and slightly warmed from the last of the fire's heat. I ate standing up. The beans were unremarkable and necessary. "Tell me about the passage," I said. Silas pulled on his pack and adjusted the straps with practiced hands. "There are 3 sections. The first 2 are tight but manageable if you move slowly and stay low. The 3rd section is the one that matters." He looked at me steadily. 15 feet of horizontal crawl. At the midpoint, the ceiling drops to approximately 4 inches above your face if you are lying completely flat. The width is enough for your shoulders if you exhale and keep your arms forward. I finished the beans and set the tin down. "And you've been through it before." "Many times. It's part of my regular route between the lower system and the upper chambers." He paused. "Most of the time it presents no difficulty. The difficulty is psychological, not physical. The body fits. The mind sometimes does not." He said it without judgment as a statement of observed fact. I respected that. We left the chamber at what Silas gauged to be 4:15, moving by lantern light through passages that had become slightly familiar over the past several hours. My body had begun to recalibrate to the cave the way bodies do when given no alternative, and my steps were steadier than they had been the night before. The first section of the crawl arrived without ceremony. The passage simply dropped to knee height, and I went down onto all 4s and moved through it. The rock was cool and damp against my palms. My ribs complained but held. The second section was lower, requiring my chest to be near the floor, elbows forward, moving in the pulling motion of a swimmer. The lantern, which Silas had configured to attach to a strap across his forehead, threw long shadows across the stone ahead of me. I focused on his boots, on the rhythm of his movement, on the sound of his breathing, which remained even and slow. We came out into a small connecting chamber, and I stood and rolled my shoulders and said nothing about how much the second section had cost me. "That's the approach," Silas said. He held the lantern forward to illuminate the far wall of the chamber where the passage continued. "The main section starts there." I looked at the opening. It was roughly oval, wider than it was tall, low enough that I would need to flatten myself entirely to enter it. The darkness inside it was absolute. The lantern light did not reach its end. "How long does it take?" I asked. "At my pace, about 4 minutes. At a careful pace, 8 to 10. 8 to 10 minutes. I had once spent 11 hours on a survey in a crawl space beneath a collapsed mine shaft in Colorado, and come out the other side with nothing worse than bruised knees and a story I told at conferences. I reminded myself of this. I got down and entered the passage. The first 6 feet were manageable. The ceiling was low but visible above me, close but not touching, and I moved forward with my arms extended the way Silas had instructed, pulling rather than pushing, keeping my core flat against the stone. Then the ceiling dropped. It happened gradually, and then all at once the way certain thresholds present themselves, and I became aware that the rock above my face was no longer 6 inches away, but 4, and that the walls on either side were pressing against my shoulders, and that the air that reached my lungs when I breathed was the same air I had just exhaled. My body stopped moving before I told it to. The darkness pressed in from every direction, with a physical weight I had not anticipated. My heartbeat became the loudest thing in the world, faster and louder and faster still. And the stone above my nose was 4 inches away, and I could feel the mass of the mountain above that stone, the hundreds of feet of rock and earth and time pressing down, and my hands pressed flat against the cave floor and found no purchase, and my breath came short and shallow and wrong. "Arthur?" Silas's voice came from ahead, calm and close. "Talk to me." I could not form words. My throat had closed around them. "That's all right," he said, as though my silence were simply information and not failure. "Put your right hand in your jacket pocket. The left one. Do it now." My hand moved because his voice gave it somewhere to go. My fingers found the bracelet. Clara's bracelet, the worn leather cord, the smooth carved wood at the center. I closed my fist around it. "Good," Silas said. "Now listen to my voice and nothing else. Not the rock, not the dark, just my voice." A pause. "Clara used to say the mountains were honest. You want to know what I think that means?" I focused on the question with everything I had. "I think it means they show you exactly what you're made of," he said. "No more, no less. And right now, the mountain is showing me a man who has survived worse than this and kept his field notes in order while he did it." His voice did not waver. "One pull forward. Just one." My arms moved. "Good. Another." I pulled myself forward inch by inch through the narrowest point, fist closed around the bracelet, eyes fixed on the dim glow of Silas's lantern ahead, breathing in the small, shallow breaths that were all the space allowed, and the ceiling stayed where it was and did not descend further, and the passage did not close. And Silas's voice came back every few seconds with something steady and plain and real. And then the ceiling rose. I pulled myself out into the wider passage on the other side and lay flat on the cave floor for a full minute, chest-heaving ribs burning, both hands pressed against the stone. Silas crouched beside me and said nothing, which was exactly right. When I finally pushed myself upright and sat back against the wall, I opened my fist and looked at the bracelet. "Thank you," I said. My voice came out rough and uneven. Silas took the bracelet back and slipped it into his pocket, with the careful habit of long practice. "Clara would have liked you," he said simply. From somewhere below and ahead of us, growing steadily louder in the silence, came the sound of rushing water. Not dripping now, not trickling. A deep, continuous roar that filled the passage and climbed into my chest. Silas raised the lantern and looked toward the sound. The expression on his face shifted in a way that tightened something in my stomach. "That's louder than it should be," he said. The chamber opened ahead of us like a held breath finally released. After hours of narrow passages and ceilings that demanded we make ourselves small, the space we stepped into was enormous. By comparison, a natural vault, maybe 50 feet across, with walls that curved upward and inward to meet at a point lost in shadow above the reach of our lantern. The floor sloped downward toward the far edge where the rock simply ended and the underground river began. I heard it before I saw it. That deep, continuous roar I had noticed from the passage, closer now and more complex. Not a single sound, but a layering of sounds, the rush of moving water, the slap of current against stone, the low resonance of something large and fast moving through a confined space. Silas walked to the edge and held the lantern out over the water. The river was black and fast. It moved with the purposeful urgency of water that has somewhere to be, filling the channel from wall to wall and throwing up a fine, cold mist that reached us where we stood. In my fieldwork, I had documented dozens of underground waterways in the mountain ranges of the American West. I knew what they looked like at normal levels. I knew the particular color of limestone at the waterline, the mineral staining that marked where a river habitually ran. The staining on these walls was 18 inches above the current surface. Silas crouched and held the lantern close to the rock face at the water's edge. He studied the wall for a long moment, without speaking, his fingers tracing the demarcation line between wet stone and dry with the careful attention of a man reading a document. "The normal level is here," he said, indicating the mineral stain line above. "This river has been running at this depth for at least 3 years. I have measurements." He looked at the current surface. "It is running 1.5 feet low, and that current speed is wrong for low water. Low water runs slow. This is running fast." I stood beside him and looked at the water and felt the cold mist settle on my face and worked through the hydrology. "Something is blocking the outflow," I said. "Yes. Downstream. Something introduced into the channel at a point below here significant enough to reduce the volume passing through, but not enough to stop the flow entirely." I looked at Silas. "The current speed tells you there's pressure building behind whatever the obstruction is, which means the water level here will rise as the blockage holds." He stood. "The rate depends on what was used and how well it was placed, but this channel feeds from a significant catchment area. Given the current differential, I would estimate we have between 6 and 10 hours before this floor is underwater." 6 to 10 hours. I looked at the floor beneath my feet, at the gentle slope toward the water's edge, at the distance between where I stood and where the river currently ran. "He knew this passage," I said. The words came out flat and certain. "He knew it from my hydrological surveys. I mapped the drainage pattern of this entire range 2 years ago as part of the mineral assessment. The data was in my office." Silas looked at me. "The survey identified 3 points in the lower channel where natural constrictions made the waterway vulnerable to obstruction," I said. "I flagged them as geological hazards in my report. I noted the specific materials and volumes that would be required to create a significant blockage at each point." I stopped. The full weight of what I was saying assembled itself in my chest like stones being stacked. I wrote the manual for this. He used my own research to plan it. The river roared beneath us, indifferent and continuous. Silas set the lantern on a flat rock and looked at me with an expression that was not pity and not anger, but something quieter and more considered. "You could not have known he would use it this way." "No," I said. "But I gave him everything he needed. The survey data, the coordinates, the specific vulnerabilities of this system. I handed it to him in a folder with my institution's letterhead on the cover." My voice stayed level, but something underneath it was not level at all. "I thought I was sharing my work with my son. I thought he was interested." "He was interested," Silas said, "just not in the science." I turned away from the water and looked at the far wall of the chamber. The mineral veins I had been tracking for 5 years ran through the limestone here in thick, dark bands, rich and untouched, and utterly indifferent to everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. The earth did not know what had been done in its name. It simply continued being what it was. "Eleanor," I said quietly. Silas looked at me. "I was going to name the deposit after my wife," I said. "Eleanor Ridge. She used to come with me on survey trips when we were first married before Julian was born. She would sit outside the tent in the evenings and watch the mountain change color as the light moved, and she would say that she could feel the time in the rock. The deep time, the kind that makes human lives feel brief and bright. I looked at the mineral vein in the wall. She deserved to have her name on something that lasted. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She still does." The simplicity of it stopped something in my chest. I turned back to the water. The practical problem was still there, unchanged and urgent, and I had spent enough years in the field to know that grief and logistics had to share the same space when the situation demanded it. "The ridge trail," I said. "You mentioned it when you described the route. A ledge along the river wall. It runs along the eastern face for approximately 200 yards, then widens before the underwater passage." Silas picked up the lantern and moved it to illuminate the far wall, where a narrow shelf of rock ran above the current waterline. At present levels, that trail gives us about 2 feet of clearance above the water. And as the level rises, that clearance decreases. He met my gaze directly. "We need to move now, not in an hour. Every minute we wait, the margin gets smaller." I picked up my pack. The sample case inside was sealed and waterproofed. The specimens I had come to find still intact, still labeled in my handwriting, still evidence of something real and documented, and mine. "Lead the way," I said. Silas lifted the lantern and started toward the eastern wall, and I followed him onto the ledge above the black and rising water, one careful step at a time. The ledge was 8 inches wide at its broadest point. I discovered this by pressing my back against the cave wall and looking down at my boots, which extended past the edge by approximately 2 inches on the outer side. The river ran 4 feet below us, black and fast, and entirely unconcerned with our presence. The mist it threw up had already soaked through my jacket at the shoulders and was working its way down my collar with the patient persistence of water finding its level. Silas moved ahead of me with the unhurried confidence of a man who had walked this particular ledge many times and had made his peace with what it asked of him. His shoulders stayed square to the wall, his feet placed sideways, each step deliberate and complete before the next one began. He did not look down. I followed his example and did not look down either. "Hands flat on the wall behind you," he said without turning. "Don't grip. Gripping makes you lean forward. Lean forward, and the geometry works against you." I spread my palms against the limestone and felt the cold of it move up through my wrists. The rock was wet and slightly textured, offering more purchase than it appeared to from a distance. I focused on that texture, on the specific roughness of it against my skin, on the weight of my boots and the placement of each step. 40 feet? 60. The ledge widened briefly to perhaps 14 inches, and I breathed more easily for a moment, before it narrowed again to something that required my full attention and nothing left over. "How are your ribs?" Silas asked. "Present," I said. He made a sound that might have been a laugh in better circumstances. "We'll rest at the wide section, another 30 yards. We moved in silence for those 30 yards, and the wide section when it came was roughly 3 feet across and felt like a ballroom by comparison. I put my back against the wall and slid down to sitting, and Silas did the same, and we sat with our legs stretched out over the edge and the river roaring below us, and the lantern between us, throwing warm light across the wet stone. He produced 2 protein bars from his jacket pocket and handed one across without ceremony. I unwrapped it and ate and looked at the far wall of the chamber, where the mineral formations caught the lantern light and threw it back in fragments. The veins ran deep here, unmistakable even in this light. This was the heart of what I had spent 5 years looking for, and I was sitting above it on a narrow rock shelf with water rising below me, and a man I had known for less than 12 hours. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Go ahead. When you found me last night, in that first chamber," I chose the words carefully, You said you came to check because you heard something and smelled something that concerned you. But you came armed. You came prepared for the possibility that whatever had caused the disturbance might still be there. Silas finished his protein bar and folded the wrapper into a precise square. That's not a question yet. How often does something happen in this cave system that requires that kind of preparation? He looked at the river below us. Never in 3 years. This cave is remote enough that I have had no human contact since I came here. The occasional animal, nothing more. He paused. Which is why last night concerned me. The sound was wrong. The smell was wrong. And then I found you, and the nature of your injuries and your condition told me that whatever had happened was not accidental. I nodded slowly. Then I reached into my jacket and felt the weight of my phone in the inner pocket. I had not thought about it since entering the cave. The battery would be nearly gone by now, given the time elapsed, and the lack of signal which the phone would have been burning power searching for. I pulled it out and looked at the dark screen. "Put it away," Silas said. His voice had changed slightly, a new quality in it, specific and careful. I looked at him. "Turn it off completely," he said. "Not sleep mode. Off, hold the button until it shuts down fully. There's no signal down here." "I know." He met my eyes. "Turn it off anyway." I held the button and watched the screen go through its shutdown sequence and go dark. "Tell me why." Silas was quiet for a moment, looking at the phone in my hand, with the expression of a man assembling a set of facts he would prefer not to have. "Your son knew where to find the blockage point in this river system," he said. "He knew which specific location in the lower channel was vulnerable. That information was in your surveys, yes. But surveys cover large areas. The surveys would have told him the general zone." He paused. "For the precision he demonstrated, he would have needed to know your exact movements in this system, your specific coordinates, where you went and when." I stared at the dead phone in my hand. "I'm not saying that's what happened," Silas said. "I'm saying it would explain the precision. And I'm saying that if something on that device has been reporting your location, turning it off now is not too late to matter." Yeah, I thought about Julian asking to see my phone 3 weeks ago, wanting to look at the survey photos he had said. He had held it for perhaps 4 minutes and handed it back and poured me a glass of water and asked about the preliminary mineral assay numbers with what I had read as genuine curiosity. 4 minutes. My hand closed around the phone and held it. "He's been watching," I said. The words came out quiet and without effect, the way words come out. When the mind has reached a conclusion, it has not yet fully transmitted to the rest of the body. Since I showed him the map, he's been watching every step. Silas said nothing, and the quality of his silence was the quality of a man who had suspected this and had waited for me to arrive at it myself. I put the phone in my pack in the bottom under the sample case. "How much further to the underwater section?" I asked. "An hour on the ledge," Silas said. "Then a short rest before we go under." He stood and lifted the lantern. "The water has come up another 2 inches since we sat down." I looked at the river below and found the mark I had noted when we stopped. He was right. 2 inches in the time it had taken us to eat and talk and arrive at a truth I was not ready for. I put my back to the wall and placed my first step back onto the narrow ledge. "Silas," I said. He looked back. "When this is over," I said, "I want to know everything you observed about how that entrance was sealed. Every detail. The method, the materials, the placement." I looked at him steadily. "I am going to need to be very specific when I talk to the police." Something in his expression settled into a new configuration, something that was not quite relief, but was adjacent to it. "I'll tell you everything I know," he said. We moved back out onto the ledge above the black and rising river toward the underwater passage that waited for us at the far end of the dark. The passage ended at a wall of water, not a waterfall, not a cascade, but a clean, horizontal termination where the ledge simply stopped and the river filled the remaining space from floor to ceiling, wall to wall, black and moving and absolute. The lantern light caught the surface and threw it back in fragments, and beyond the surface there was nothing to see. Just depth and current, and the 5 or 6 meters of submerged passage that Silas had described 2 days ago in the abstract, and that now existed in front of us as a specific and immediate fact. Silas set the lantern on a flat rock and opened his pack. "The devices are simple," he said, producing 2 objects that resembled modified snorkels, short tubes fitted with improvised valves made from rubber and wire. "They give you a reserve of air, not a supply. The difference matters. You breathe in from the tube, you exhale away from it. If you breathe out into the tube, you flood it and lose the reserve." He demonstrated the motion, in a way. When the reserve is gone, you will feel it. At that point, you swim. You do not stop to think. You swim. I took the device and turned it over in my hands. It was rough work, functional rather than elegant, the kind of thing made by someone with engineering knowledge and limited materials and a great deal of time. It would do what it needed to do. "Current reads stronger than usual," Silas said, looking at the water. "Stay low against the bottom. The current runs fastest at mid-depth and slowest near the floor. Keep your arms close to your body until you feel the passage widen, then pull hard upward." He looked at me. "I go first. I confirm it is clear. You count to 60 and follow. And if you are not on the other side when I surface," his eyes held mine, "I will be." He adjusted his pack straps, tucked the breathing device into position, and without ceremony stepped off the ledge into the river. The water took him immediately. One moment he was there, and the next the current had him, and I watched the pale shape of him move beneath the surface, angling low against the bottom, just as he had described. Arms tight, body flat, moving with a controlled efficiency that came from 12 years of rescue work and 3 years of living in a system where this passage was simply part of the route between one chamber and the next. Then he was gone. Past the point where the lantern light reached, I counted. 47 seconds later, he surfaced on the far side. I could see him in the lantern glow, wet and breathing hard, one arm raised. I adjusted my pack, checked the sample case, positioned the breathing device, looked once at the dark water and thought of Eleanor, not as she was at the end, but as she was on a survey trip in the Cascades in 1989, sitting on a rock above a mountain stream, with her boots off and her feet in the current, laughing at something I had said that I could no longer remember. I stepped off the ledge. The cold was extraordinary. Every nerve in my body registered it simultaneously, a full-body shock that drove the air from my lungs before I had intended to exhale. The current took me sideways, then corrected as I angled my body low, the way Silas had shown me, and I found the bottom with my fingertips and pulled myself forward along it, hand over rough stone. The breathing device gave me 2 pulls of air. 3. The reserve was smaller than I had expected, the tube shorter, and the modified valve allowed a slight backflow that dampened what I received. I pulled myself forward. The passage narrowed, then widened slightly. I could feel the current changing, less lateral pressure, more forward momentum, which meant I was through the worst of the constriction. Then the current shifted without warning. A surge, sudden and strong, coming from somewhere lateral. A secondary channel feeding into the main passage at a point Silas had not mentioned or had not known about. It hit me broadside and spun me, and my hand lost the bottom, and the breathing device pulled free in the tumbling motion that followed, torn loose and gone, carried away by the current before my hand could find it again. I had approximately 15 seconds of air remaining in my lungs. I tucked, pulled my arms in, let the current carry me forward, because fighting it would cost more air than following it. My lungs began the particular protest that has no analog in surface experience, the full-body insistence of oxygen debt, the message that arrives not as thought, but as sensation, total and overriding. Something found my arm, a hand. Silas's hand coming from above and to the right, finding my jacket sleeve, with the certainty of someone who had reached into dark water before and knew how to make contact in conditions where contact was not guaranteed. He pulled. I kicked toward where I calculated the surface to be. We came up together. I gasped. The sound that came out of me was not dignified, and I did not care. I grabbed the rock ledge with both hands and hung there while my lungs reacquainted themselves with the concept of air, pulling it in great ragged quantities, coughing out the water that had found its way in during those last seconds below. Silas had both hands on my jacket, holding me against the ledge. His knuckles were white with the effort. "You lost the device," he said. Not a question. "Current surge," I managed. "Secondary channel." He nodded, still breathing hard himself. I felt it from above. It wasn't there last week. He helped me pull myself fully onto the ledge, and I lay flat on the cold stone and stared up at the cave ceiling, and breathed with the focused gratitude of a man reacquainting himself with something he had briefly lost. "The blockage downstream is affecting the whole system," Silas said, sitting beside me. "Changing the flow patterns. Channels that were dry or slow are running now." He paused. He thought of more than the main passage. I turned my head and looked at him. He was soaked through his beard, dripping, his hands still not entirely steady. He had gone back into that water after surfacing, had come back for me. "You shared your air," I said. He looked at the ceiling rather than at me. "Standard emergency protocol, buddy breathing. 2 rescuers, 1 supply, alternate pulls." He said it the way professionals describe the mechanics of something that cost them personally. "I was trained for it." "I know you were trained for it," I said. "That is not what I said." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Clara would have had words for me if I had done otherwise." I sat up slowly. My hands were shaking, and I let them shake because there was no practical reason to stop them. The sample case in my pack had held. The specimens were intact. My field recorder, sealed in its own waterproof pouch in the inner pocket, was intact. Everything that needed to survive had survived. "How far to the surface?" I asked. 4 hours, Silas said. "Uphill most of the way. The air changes about 2 hours in. You will smell pine before you see light." I got to my feet. "Then we should not waste time sitting here," I said. Silas looked up at me from where he sat, still catching his breath, water running from his jacket onto the stone floor. For a moment, his expression was unguarded, in a way it had not been before at something passing across it that was not quite surprise but was close to it. He stood, picked up the lantern, and started toward the upward passage without another word. I followed him, still shaking, toward whatever was waiting above. The upward passage smelled different from everything below it. Not dramatically different. Not the sudden rush of pine and open sky that Silas had promised for 2 hours ahead of us, but subtly different, a slight loosening of the mineral heaviness that had characterized the air since I first woke in the lower chamber. It was the kind of difference you noticed only if you had been paying attention to the baseline for long enough, which 41 years of underground fieldwork had trained me to do without thinking. I noticed it, and said nothing, and kept climbing. The passage rose at roughly a 15-degree grade, uneven underfoot, but manageable, requiring hands as well as feet in some sections where the floor had broken into natural steps of varying height. Silas set the pace measured and consistent, and I matched it and found that matching it left my mind with more capacity than I wanted for thinking about things other than the immediate problem of where to place my next step. My clothes were still wet from the river. The cold had settled in at a level below discomfort, the level where the body simply accepts the condition and redistributes its resources accordingly. My hands had stopped shaking sometime in the first 10 minutes of climbing. My ribs had reached an accommodation, with the demands being placed on them that involved a specific radiating ache that intensified on the steeper sections and eased on the flatter ones. I focused on the ache. It was useful in the way that all honest pain is useful. It told me exactly where I was. "Tell me the rest," I said. Silas glanced back. "The rest of what?" "The phone. You told me to turn it off, and you told me why in general terms, but you were specific about the blockage point downstream. You said his precision implied he had exact coordinates, not just survey data." I paused on a difficult step, placed my hand on the wall for balance, and continued. "Survey data covers a large area. Exact coordinates means he knew where I was standing at specific moments in this system. Walk me through how that works." Silas climbed for a moment without answering. Not reluctance I had come to recognize, but his habitual pause before speaking, the pause of a man who preferred to be accurate over being fast. "Location tracking software," he said. "There are applications available to anyone with internet access and basic technical knowledge. They install in under 3 minutes on a device and run in the background without visible evidence. They report GPS coordinates at set intervals to a remote account. The person monitoring that account sees a map. They see every location the device visits, the time spent at each location, the route taken between them." He looked back at me. "If someone installed that kind of application on your phone 3 weeks ago, they would have a complete record of every survey coordinate you visited since then." I thought about my survey schedule over the past 3 weeks. The upper chambers, which I had revisited twice to refine my measurements. The specific point on the eastern face where the vein ran closest to the surface. The hydrological assessment I had conducted along the lower channel, where I had noted the 3 constriction points and their vulnerability to obstruction. I had documented all of it, on my phone, with GPS coordinates attached to every photograph. "He didn't need to read my reports," I said. "He watched me write them." "In real time," Silas said. "Every coordinate you flagged, every location you marked as significant, he had it as soon as your phone logged it." I stopped walking. Not because I needed to stop, but because the full architecture of what Julian had built required a moment to be properly apprehended. I stood in the upward passage with the wet cave wall under my hand and assembled it piece by piece, the way I assembled geological evidence, laying each fact against the next, checking for consistency, following the structure to its conclusion. He had installed the software when he came to visit 6 weeks ago. Before I made the discovery, he had been patient enough to wait, monitoring my movements the way a scientist monitors an experiment, watching for the signal that would tell him his investment of time and preparation was about to pay off. When I found the vein and called him from the site he had already known within 50 meters where I was standing, he had already begun to plan the camping trip, the specific date he had chosen. The equipment in his bag that I had noticed was heavier than necessary and had not questioned because he was my son, and I had been taught by a better version of myself to extend good faith to the people I loved. "He called it a camping trip," I said. "He said he wanted to see the site, to be part of it." My voice was steady. I made it steady the way you make a hand steady before a precise measurement. He used the exact language he knew I wanted to hear. He always knew exactly what I wanted to hear. Silas turned fully and looked at me. His expression held something careful in it. "He is good at reading people," I said. He always was. As a child, he could identify what a person needed from them and provide it with a consistency that I mistook for emotional intelligence. I looked at the cave wall, at the mineral vein running through it, dark and rich and utterly indifferent. It was not emotional intelligence. It was something colder than that. He understood people the way a craftsman understands his tools, functionally, without sentiment. Arthur. I looked at him. He was also your son, Silas said. Both things are true at the same time. You are allowed to know what he is and still grieve what you thought he was. The words landed with the particular impact of something true spoken plainly. I held them for a moment, and then I did something I had not done since I was a much younger man, standing in a hospital corridor, being told that Eleanor's prognosis had changed significantly for the worse. My throat closed and my eyes burned, and I pressed the back of my wrist against my mouth and stood there in the upward passage of a mountain cave with my wet clothes and my broken ribs and 41 years of practiced self-possession cracking down the middle. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Then I breathed out slowly through my nose and lowered my hand and looked at the passage ahead. The alibi, I said. My voice was rough but functional. He will have one. Whatever he told people about where he was when this happened, it will be convincing. Yes, Silas said. He did not minimize it or offer false reassurance, which I appreciated more than comfort would have given me. It will need to be taken apart carefully. Thomas can do that, I said. Sheriff Thomas. He has known me for 20 years. He will listen to the evidence before he listens to the story. I paused. And I have evidence. The samples. The survey records on my field recorder. I touched the inner pocket of my jacket where the sealed recorder sat. I have documentation of everything I found. Everything that makes this worth what Julian did. And you have a witness, Silas said quietly. I looked at him. He was standing in the lantern light with his wet jacket and his 3-year beard, and the particular stillness of a man who had spent a long time alone and had not expected to find himself here in this passage making this offer. Yes, I said, I do. He turned and resumed climbing, and I followed, and the air around us continued its slow and almost imperceptible shift towards something that smelled less like mineral and more like weather, and somewhere far above us impossible to see. But beginning in some way I could not yet articulate to be felt, the surface waited. Silas, I said, as we climbed. Yes, when Thomas asks how you know what you know about this cave system. I found my footing on a broken step and pulled myself up. Tell him everything, all of it. The 3 years, the surveys, the maps you drew. I looked at the back of his head, the set of his shoulders, the steadiness of his pace. He needs to understand that your knowledge of this place is not incidental. It is expertise, and expertise is something a court of law takes seriously. Silas climbed in silence for a moment. You're already building the case, he said. I have been building cases my entire career, I said. The materials are different. The method is the same. I pulled myself over a difficult section and stood upright in a wider part of the passage. Evidence first, conclusions follow. You do not begin with what you want to prove. You begin with what the evidence shows. And what does the evidence show? I thought about the sealed samples in my pack. The recorder. The dead phone, with its 3 weeks of location data now frozen in whatever state it had been in when I powered it down. The specific weight distribution of Julian's bag on the trail. The heavier than necessary load that I had noticed and filed and not acted on. It shows. I said that my son planned this for at least 3 weeks, used my own research as his blueprint, and left enough physical evidence behind to occupy a federal prosecutor for the better part of a year. Above us, faint but unmistakable, the air moved with something new in it. Pine, cold and sharp and real. 2 hours, Silas said, and for the first time since I had met him, something in his voice sounded like hope. The pine smell grew stronger with every 100 feet of elevation. It arrived in waves rather than as a continuous presence carried on the slow breath of air that moved down through the upper passages from whatever crack or fissure connected this system to the outside world. Each wave lasted only a few seconds before the mineral heaviness of the cave reasserted itself. But those seconds were enough. They were a promise. Concrete, specific, and unlike any abstract reassurance, a promise that could be smelled. I found myself timing my steps to the intervals between them. The passage had widened considerably in the past hour. We were moving through what Silas called the upper transition zone, where the deep cave geology gave way to something closer to the surface, the rock less compressed, the formations younger and less complex, the ceiling high enough in places that our lantern light did not reach it. My boots found better purchase on this floor. My ribs had settled into a background complaint that I had learned to treat as information rather than instruction. "Tell me about Eleanor Ridge," Silas said. He said it without preamble, the way he said most things, and I took a moment before answering, because the question deserved more than an automatic response. "The vein runs northeast for approximately 2 miles through the lower granite formation," I said. "At its widest point, it measures nearly 4 feet across. The coltan concentration is significantly higher than anything documented in this range, and the associated rare earth elements suggest a deposit that formed under unusual pressure conditions approximately 300 million years ago." I paused. "In practical terms, the conservative valuation puts it above $4 billion. The realistic valuation is higher." "That's not what I asked," Silas said. I looked at the back of his head as he climbed ahead of me. "You asked me about Eleanor Ridge." "I asked you about Eleanor Ridge," he confirmed, "not the mineral composition." I climbed in silence for a moment. "Eleanor used to say that the best things in the world were the things that had been waiting longest to be found," I said. "She said patience was a form of faith, that if you kept looking, the earth would eventually show you something worth the looking." I found a handhold on a steep section and pulled myself up. "I found this deposit the year after she died. I have spent 5 years documenting it carefully alone the way she would have wanted it done. And I intended to give it her name because it seemed to me that she had been waiting for it longer than I had." Silas said nothing, and his silence was the kind that holds something rather than lacks it. We climbed for another 20 minutes before he spoke again. "There is something I want to ask you about," he said. "Something that has been in the back of my thinking since last night." He stopped at a wide section of the passage and turned to face me. "The access your son had to your research, we have established that clearly. The location data, the surveys, the hydrological reports." He paused. "But physical access to this site requires more than data. It requires legal standing. Whatever he is planning to do with this discovery, he needs documentation that gives him the right to act on it." I stood on the passage floor and felt something cold move through me that had nothing to do with the temperature of the cave. "The grant application," I said. Silas watched me. 3 weeks ago, 8 days before the camping trip, Julian had come to my house on a Tuesday evening with a folder of paperwork. He had been helpful and organized in the way he was occasionally helpful and organized when he wanted something from me, and he had explained that there was a research funding application that required my signature as the primary investigator, and that the deadline was the following morning, and that he had already reviewed the full document, and it was standard institutional language, and that I only needed to sign the final page. I had been home for 4 hours after a 12-hour field day. I had eaten a cold meal standing at the kitchen counter, and I had been considering bed when Julian arrived. He had sat across from me at the kitchen table and placed the folder in front of me and turned to the final page and handed me a pen. I had signed. I had not read the document. He had a folder, I said. My voice was very level. He told me it was a research funding application. Standard language, he said. He had reviewed it. He just needed my signature on the final page. I looked at Silas. I signed it without reading it. I was tired and I trusted him, and I signed a document I did not read. Silas's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted slightly, an almost imperceptible settling the posture of a man who had anticipated this answer and found no satisfaction in being right. What was it actually? I asked, though I already knew the shape of the answer. I cannot say for certain, Silas said, but if he had legal documents prepared and needed your authentic signature on a specific page, and he created conditions under which you would sign without reading the most useful document, for his purposes, would have been something that transferred your rights to the discovery. He paused. Intellectual property in the case of an academic researcher covers the discovery itself, the right to develop it, license it, profit from it. I sat down on a flat rock. The document would have been prepared by someone who understood intellectual property law. Julian knew people like that. He moved in circles that included lawyers and financial advisors, and the kind of professionals who understood how rights were structured and transferred. A single signature on a single page buried in a thick folder of legitimate-looking institutional language witnessed by no one, because there had been no one else in the room. It would be voidable, I said, thinking aloud, the way I thought through field problems out loud and in sequence. A signature obtained through fraudulent misrepresentation, where the signatory was deliberately misled about the nature of the document, is not a valid transfer of rights under contract law. The fraud vitiates the consent. I looked up, but he would not need it to hold up permanently. He would only need it to hold long enough for him to establish the commercial relationships. Once the investors were committed, and the contracts were signed on his end, unwinding it becomes exponentially more complicated. How long would that take? Silas asked. A motivated investor with capital ready to deploy. I thought of the kind of people Julian courted, the Wall Street connections he cultivated with the same care I gave to my field surveys. 3 to 4 days from the moment he announced my death. We looked at each other across the passage. He has been moving since he came down from the mountain, I said. Yes, Silas said. I stood. The cold that had moved through me earlier had settled into something different, something harder and more purposeful. I reached into my pack and checked the sample case by touch, the familiar weight and shape of it, the specimens inside labeled in my handwriting, with dates that predated any document Julian could have produced. Physical evidence, dated, documented, in my handwriting. There is one more thing, I said. Silas waited. He has a credit card, I said. A supplementary card on my account. I gave it to him 18 months ago for daily expenses emergencies. I looked at Silas. Whatever he used to seal that entrance, whatever equipment and materials were required, he would have purchased them in advance. Days, probably a week or more before we came up here. I paused. He was careful about everything else. He was not careful about this because he intended to be the only person left alive who knew the account existed. Silas was quiet for a moment. That is a paper trail. That is a federal paper trail, I said. Every purchase on that card is time-stamped, vendor identified, and linked to my account. If he bought what I think he bought in the quantities required, the record of it exists in a database that does not forget. Above us, through a crack in the passage ceiling, I had not noticed before, a thin needle of actual light fell across the cave floor. Not lantern light, not amber and warm, white and cold and coming from outside. Silas looked up at it. We are close, he said. I looked at that needle of light on the cave floor and felt something in my chest that had been wound very tight for a very long time begin slowly and carefully to ease. Then let's not stop here, I said. The vines were the first thing I touched. Not the light, not the air, not the ground outside, but a curtain of dried vine growth hanging across the cave opening, like something a careful person had arranged for privacy, brown and brittle with the season crackling under my hands as I pushed through. Silas had gone first, as he had gone first, through every difficult passage in the past 2 days, and by the time I stepped out behind him, the sun was already on my face, and I had to stop moving because my eyes, which had been operating in lantern light and darkness for the better part of 3 days, had no immediate capacity for what was being asked of them. I stood with my hands at my sides and my eyes pressed shut and let the light work on me. It was warm in a way I had forgotten light could be warm. Not the warmth of a fire which is aggressive and directional, but the diffuse surrounding warmth of afternoon sun falling on a south-facing slope, reaching every surface simultaneously, finding every cold place I had been carrying, and beginning without urgency to address them. The air moved against my face and it smelled of pine resin and dried grass and something beneath those something older and cleaner. The particular scent of high-elevation air in October in the northern Rockies that I had spent decades breathing in and had apparently needed to nearly lose in order to fully appreciate. I opened my eyes by degrees. The Bitterroot Range spread out below us in the particular amber and rust of late fall. The larches gone gold, the pines holding their green against the seasonal change around them. The ridgeline to the east, catching the afternoon light in a way that made the rock glow. The valley below was visible in fragments through the tree cover, and at the far edge of it, small with distance, the scattered rooftops of Elkhorn sat in the afternoon light, like something from a painting of a place rather than the place itself. I turned in a slow circle and felt the sun reach the back of my neck. "Give yourself a minute," Silas said. He was sitting on a flat rock near the cave entrance pack off face tilted upward, his eyes closed. He looked in that moment like a man who had forgotten he was allowed to sit in the sun and was in the process of remembering. I gave myself a minute. Then the sound reached us. It came from the north, low and rhythmic, the unmistakable percussion of rotor blades working against thin mountain air. A search helicopter flying a grid pattern at maybe 500 feet, moving in a systematic back and forth that covered the upper slopes in overlapping passes. Professional and methodical, and from where we stood, clearly visible against the pale sky. Silas opened his eyes. We looked at each other and did not need to discuss it. I moved first, stepping back under the overhang of the cave entrance where the rock jutted out, and the shadow was deep. Silas followed without being asked, pulling his pack with him, and we stood in the shadow and watched the helicopter work its pattern above the tree line to the north. "He called it in," I said. "Of course he did." Silas watched the aircraft. A father who dies in a cave-in while his son watches helplessly. The son calls search and rescue immediately. He stays in the area. He cooperates fully with authorities. He paused. It completes the picture. I thought about Julian at the trailhead, watching the entrance collapse, and then driving down the mountain and making the calls in precisely the right order. His voice breaking in precisely the right places, the grief calibrated to the audience and the moment, the way all of his performances were calibrated. He would have been on the phone with search and rescue within the hour. He would have met them at the site. He would have pointed at the collapsed entrance and described the accident with the particular detail that makes a story credible, just enough specificity, never so much that it becomes a list. He would have been very good at it. The helicopter completed another pass and moved south, its sound fading gradually into the general noise of wind through the pines. If they find us up here, I said, the first calls go to Julian. He is the next of kin on file. He is the person who reported the incident. Whatever we tell the search team, he hears within the hour. And he adjusts, Silas said. He adjusts. I looked at the rooftops of Elkhorn in the valley below. Thomas is down there. He has known me for 20 years. He was at my wife's funeral. He came to my house the Christmas after she died, because he knew I would not go anywhere. I looked at Silas. If I walk into his office, he will listen to me before he calls anyone else. I am certain of that. How certain? I thought about Thomas. The way he had looked at me at Eleanor's graveside, that particular expression of a man who understood grief because he had carried his own share of it, and who did not try to fix what could not be fixed, and who showed up anyway. Certain enough to stake the next step on it, I said. Silas studied the slope below us. The angle was steep for the first 100 yards, then gentled into a series of natural terraces that ran down through the tree cover toward the valley floor. An experienced mountain person could make it in 2 hours without a trail. Silas, I had established, was a very experienced mountain person. There is a way down through the east face that avoids the main trail, he said. The search teams will be working the established trail network. If we go east and stay in the tree cover, we come out on the lower road about a mile north of town. How long? 2 hours, maybe 2.5. You are moving on less sleep and more damage than you were yesterday. I looked at my hands. The knuckles were scraped raw from the crawl space. There was dried cave mud in the creases of my palms. My jacket was still damp at the shoulders from the river. I looked, I imagined, like a man who had spent 3 days underground, which was precisely what I was. I can do 2.5 hours, I said. Silas stood, pulled on his pack, and looked at me with the measuring expression I had come to recognize as his version of asking if I was ready. I pulled on my own pack. The sample case sat in the main compartment, sealed and intact, 41 years of field experience distilled into a set of labeled specimens that represented, among other things, the most significant geological discovery in the northern Rockies in a generation. Julian had tried to make it his. He had not understood that the evidence was in the samples, and the samples were on my back, and I was still standing. We moved east into the tree cover, staying below the ridgeline, where the helicopter had been working, and the pine smell was everywhere now, not a promise but a fact, and the light moved through the branches overhead in long, shifting columns that caught the dust. We raised with our boots and turned it briefly gold before letting it settle. Silas walked ahead, reading the terrain the way only someone who had spent years in it could read it, choosing the line of least resistance with an instinct that looked effortless but was not. I followed and thought about Thomas, and about what I was going to say when I walked through his door, and about the expression on Julian's face when he understood that the story he had told the world was about to meet the story I had lived. Somewhere to the north, the helicopter made another pass. We kept walking below the tree line, out of sight, toward the town in the valley, and the conversation that would change everything that came after it. We came down out of the tree cover onto the lower road at 20 minutes past 5, judging by the angle of the light. The road was unpaved and showed no recent tire tracks, which meant the search activity had concentrated on the trail network higher up, as Silas had predicted. We walked along its edge in the direction of town, and the transition from wilderness to human habitation announced itself gradually. A fence line here, a mailbox there, a dog somewhere behind a tree line that registered our passing with 2 sharp barks, and then went back to whatever it had been doing before we arrived. Elkhorn's main street was 4 blocks long and arranged with the practical honesty of a town that had never needed to advertise itself to anyone. A hardware store, a post office, a barber shop with a light on inside, a gas station at the far end with 2 pumps and a hand-lettered sign in the window that I could not read from this distance. People moved on the sidewalk with the unhurried purpose of people going about the end of an ordinary Tuesday, and none of them looked at us, and then one of them did. A woman with a grocery bag who stopped walking and stared with an expression that was not rude, but was honest, the expression of someone trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what made sense. I became aware, looking at her, looking at us, of how we must appear. 3 days of cave mud and river water had done their work on both of us. My jacket was torn at the left shoulder. Silas's beard had accumulated a quantity of limestone dust that had dried to a pale coating on the darker hair. We looked, in short, like men who had recently emerged from underground, which was precisely what we were. She kept walking. We kept walking. The diner was on the second block, a narrow building with a hand-painted sign above the door that said simply Mark's, and a window through which warm light fell onto the sidewalk in a yellow rectangle. The smell reached us before we opened the door. Coffee frying oil, something with onions, the particular combination of a small American diner at the dinner hour that carries with it an almost aggressive normality, the smell of a world in which nothing terrible has recently happened. I pushed open the door. The man behind the counter was perhaps 60, thick through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had started out open and had been weathered into something more considered by time and weather and the daily work of feeding people. He looked up when we entered, registered our condition, without visible reaction, in a way that suggested he had seen enough in his years to have suspended the practice of being surprised and set down the coffee pot he was holding. "Sit anywhere," he said. "I'll bring menus." His name was Mark. I learned this from the embroidery on his apron and confirmed it later when a woman at a corner table called it out to ask for more coffee. He brought us menus and then, without being asked, brought 2 glasses of water and set them down with the straightforward generosity of a man who could see that water was what was needed regardless of what we eventually ordered. I drank the entire glass before I looked up. The television was mounted on a bracket in the far corner of the room, angled so that most of the tables had a partial view of it. The sound was low, barely audible above the ambient noise of the diner, and I had not paid attention to it in the first minutes, because my attention had been occupied by the glass of water and the chair underneath me and the basic animal comfort of being warm and seated after 2.5 hours of difficult terrain. Then I heard the name. Not my name. Eleanor's. I looked up at the screen. Julian was standing in front of a microphone outdoors, the Bitterroot Peaks visible behind him in the late afternoon light. He was wearing a dark jacket I did not recognize, which meant he had brought it specifically, which meant he had packed for this moment, the way he packed for everything, with preparation and attention to the effect he intended to create. His eyes were appropriately reddened. His jaw was set with the particular tension of a man performing restraint. He was very good. He had always been very good. Well, my father dedicated his life to this work, Julian was saying, his voice carrying the specific texture of controlled grief, roughened at the edges, steady in the middle. He found something extraordinary up here, something that should have been his greatest achievement. He paused for exactly the right duration. I want to honor that. Which is why I am announcing today the establishment of the Arthur Vance Memorial Fund for Geological Research to be endowed with 50% of all future proceeds from the Eleanor Ridge discovery. The room went quiet around me. Not the whole room. 2 tables near the window kept their conversations. Mark was refilling a coffee cup at the counter. But in the immediate vicinity of my table, in the radius of my own perception, something had gone absolutely still. Eleanor Ridge. He had taken her name. He had taken the name I had chosen, the name I had kept to myself because it was private and not yet official, and because it belonged to a conversation between me and my wife that had happened in a tent in the Cascades 20 years ago, when she had tilted her face toward a granite wall and said that she could feel the time in the rock. He had found it somewhere in my notes or my field recordings or some document I had not known he accessed, and he had used it publicly and on camera in a sentence about his generosity. My hand closed around the water glass. Silas's hand covered mine on the table, not restraining me, not pressing down, just present the weight of a hand that understood what was happening and was offering itself as an anchor. "Easy," he said quietly. "He used her name," I said. My voice came out lower than I intended, rougher. "I know. He found her name in my notes, and he used it on television to announce a fund that he is endowing with money from a discovery he did not make and a right he does not have." My jaw was tight. I made myself open it. He stood in front of a camera and said Eleanor's name, and the people watching believed him. Mark had appeared at the edge of my peripheral vision. He stood a few feet from the table, coffee pot in hand, looking at the television, and then at me with an expression that had moved past the professional neutrality of a man running a diner into something more personal. "You look exactly like the man in that photograph," he said. He nodded toward the screen where the news segment had cut to an archival photograph I recognized as coming from my university faculty page, a headshot taken 7 years ago. "The one they're saying died up the mountain." I looked at Mark. He was a man who had spent a long career reading faces across a counter, and what I saw in his expression now was not doubt, but the careful look of someone who has arrived at a conclusion and is waiting to see if the evidence will hold. "That photograph is of me," I said. "My name is Arthur Vance. I am not dead, and the man on that screen is my son." Mark looked at the television for a long moment. Then he looked back at me. Then he set the coffee pot down on the nearest table, reached into his apron pocket, and produced a television remote. He turned the volume up just long enough for us to hear Julian finish his sentence about legacy and grief and the future his father would have wanted. Then he turned it off entirely. "Sheriff Thomas is 2 blocks east," Mark said. "He's been in his office since this morning." He looked at me with the directness of a man who has made up his mind. "I'll keep your food warm." The station was a single-story building at the end of the second block, brick and practical, with a light on above the entrance and a county seal on the door that had weathered to the point where only the general shape of it remained legible. I pushed the door open without knocking. The deputy at the front desk looked up from his computer with the expression of a man preparing a standard greeting, and then the greeting did not come because what he was looking at did not match the category his training had prepared him for. He was young, mid-20s, and he recovered quickly, which spoke well of him. "Sir, can I help?" "I need to see Thomas," I said. "Sheriff Thomas, tell him Arthur Vance is here." The deputy's mouth opened and then closed. He looked at Silas, who was standing just behind my left shoulder, in the way he had developed over 3 days of moving through difficult terrain together, slightly back, slightly to the side, present, without crowding. Then the deputy picked up his desk phone and dialed an internal extension without looking at the keypad, which meant he used it often. "Sheriff," he said, "you need to come out front." A pause. "No, sir. You just need to come out front." Thomas appeared from the back corridor 30 seconds later. He was 62 years old and had been the sheriff of this county for 19 of those years, and he looked it in the way that people who have spent a long time doing a specific and serious job look it, settled into himself, moving with the economy of a man who had stopped wasting motion sometime in his 40s. He had a face that had started out handsome and had become something more useful than handsome with the passage of time. I had known him since Eleanor was alive. He had sat in my kitchen and eaten her cooking and argued with me about local geology over her good china. He came around the corner and stopped walking. The expression that crossed his face in the first 2 seconds was not a simple expression. It moved through several things in quick succession: shock, something that was almost relief, then a careful professional recalibration that settled over all of it like a hand smoothing a document flat. He was good at his job. He did not let the shock run the room. "Arthur," he said. "Hello, Thomas." He crossed the distance between us in 4 strides and took my hand in both of his, the grip of a man making certain of something physical. And then he stepped back and looked at me with the assessing eye of a man who had spent 2 decades reading people and scenes and deciding what they meant. "3 days," he said. "3 days." I confirmed. His gaze moved to Silas. "And you are?" "Silas," Silas said. "I was in the cave system when Arthur came down. I know the passage he came through. I have a statement to give." Thomas looked at him for a moment, with the particular attention of a man filing things for later consideration. Then he said, "Come to the back." The back room was 4 chairs and a table, and a whiteboard covered in notes I did not read because they were not my business yet. Thomas sat across from us and folded his hands on the table and waited, and I told him everything in the order. It had happened the way I gave field reports, chronological and specific, without editorializing, letting the sequence carry the weight. He listened without interrupting. I had always respected that about him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he opened his laptop and turned it to face me. "I have to show you something," he said. "Julian came in this morning at 8:45. He was composed cooperative, and he brought documentation." He gestured at the screen. "This is footage from the security camera at the Elkhorn Mountain Lodge. Timestamp puts your son in the hotel conference room between 2 and 4 in the afternoon on the day of the incident." I looked at the footage. Julian clearly visible, seated at a conference table with 2 other men, papers spread in front of them, the timestamp running in the lower right corner. "The window of the incident," I said, "overlaps precisely with the timestamp on that footage." Thomas's voice was level. He also provided 3 signed statements from individuals who confirm he was at that meeting: the hotel manager, a participant in the meeting, and a front desk employee who processed his parking validation at 4:17. He paused. "Arthur, I have known you for 20 years. I am not dismissing what you have told me, but I also cannot dismiss what is in front of me. That footage and those statements taken together constitute a credible alibi." My hands were flat on the table. I kept them flat. "Thomas Toll," I said, "ask your deputy to pull the transaction history on a supplementary credit card linked to my account. The account is under my name at First Mountain Bank. The supplementary card was issued 18 months ago." I held his gaze. "Look at the purchases made on that card in the 30 days before last Tuesday." Thomas studied me for a moment. Then he turned to the doorway. "Hendricks." The deputy appeared. Thomas gave him the instruction in a few quiet words, and he disappeared again. The 3 of us sat in the back room, and the clock on the wall marked the passing minutes with a sound that was very loud in the silence. 11 minutes later, Hendricks came back with a printed sheet and set it on the table in front of Thomas. Thomas read it. His expression did not change in the theatrical way that expressions change in stories. It changed in the practical way, a slight tightening around the eyes, a fractional shift in the set of his jaw, the expression of a man whose internal calculation has just produced a new result. He slid the sheet across to me. The purchases were listed chronologically. Hardware supplier in Missoula 9 days before the camping trip. A specialty equipment company I recognized as a provider of industrial-grade materials, the kind used in controlled demolition and heavy construction 7 days before. A second transaction at the same company 4 days before. The amounts were not large by the standards of major commercial operations, but they were precisely the amounts consistent with acquiring, what would be needed to seal a cave entrance of the dimensions I had described. "He used my card," I said. "He used your card," Thomas said. Silas leaned forward slightly. "Sheriff, I need to give you my formal statement. I was present in that cave system when the entrance was sealed. I heard it happen. I have detailed knowledge of the method and the materials based on what I observed from inside the system. I also treated Mr. Vance for symptoms consistent with ingestion of a low-dose sedative compound, which I identified based on my training as a former search and rescue team leader." He paused. "I also need to tell you something about my history with this particular mountain range that will be relevant to what comes next." Thomas looked at Silas with the expression of a man recalculating how large a situation had just become. "That footage," I said, bringing his attention back to the screen. "The metadata, the file creation date, the encoding signature, the compression artifacts. A forensic analysis will tell you whether that footage was recorded when the timestamp says it was, or whether it was recorded at a different time and the timestamp was applied afterward." Thomas looked at the screen. Then he looked at me. Then he looked at the sheet of credit card transactions on the table between us. "Julian is presenting to a group of investors tomorrow morning," he said slowly. "9 a.m. at the site." He was quiet for a moment, thinking in the careful, sequential way I had always appreciated in him. "I think we need to have a conversation about how tomorrow goes." I looked across the table at Thomas and across the room at Silas and felt the pieces of the next 24 hours begin to arrange themselves into something that resembled, for the first time since I had fallen into the dark, a plan. "I think we do," I said. Thomas arranged 2 rooms at the Elkhorn Mountain Lodge, which was, with some irony, the same establishment whose security footage Julian had used to construct his alibi. The room was small and smelled of cedar, and the particular brand of industrial cleaning product that every budget motel in the American West seems to purchase from the same supplier. There was a bed, a chair, a window that looked out onto the parking lot, and a bathroom with adequate hot water, which was the only amenity that mattered. I stood under the shower for 12 minutes and watched the water run off me in colors that documented in reverse chronological order everything the past 3 days had deposited on my skin. When I came out, I sat on the edge of the bed in the clothes Thomas's deputy had sourced from a donation box at the county office, jeans that were 2 inches too short, and a flannel shirt that had belonged to someone broader than me. I sat there and looked at the window and did not lie down, because I knew what lying down would produce, which was not sleep, but the particular variety of wakefulness that comes when the body is horizontal and the mind refuses to follow. I took the field recorder out of the sealed pouch and held it in my hands. It was a compact device the size of a thick pen designed for academic fieldwork, capable of continuous recording for 14 hours on a single charge. I had carried one in my left breast pocket on every field day for the past 11 years. The habit had begun as practical documentation, a way of capturing observations without stopping to write them down, and had become over time simply part of what I wore into the field, as automatic as my boots. I had started the recording when I picked up Julian from his apartment on the morning of the trip. Not deliberately, not with any premonition of what the day would become. I had started it because I always started it when I was moving toward a field site, and the drive into the Bitterroot was in my mind that morning, the beginning of a field day. I had forgotten it was running by the time we reached the trailhead. I had not thought about it once in the 3 days since. I pressed play. The first 20 minutes were road noise and weather report from the truck radio and Julian making a phone call. I had not been paying attention to at the time, his voice low, and the call brief, lasting perhaps 90 seconds. I listened to it now with the attention I had not given it then. He was confirming a meeting time. The words were ordinary business language, time and location, and a name I did not recognize. The tone was not the tone he used with me. It was the tone of a man speaking to a collaborator level, and transactional, the voice of someone conducting the final check on an arrangement that had already been thoroughly planned. I sat very still and listened to my son's voice on a recording he did not know existed. 40 minutes in, somewhere on the mountain road above the first switchback, Julian had begun to talk. Not to me. Not directed at me. More in the manner of a man thinking aloud in the presence of someone whose reaction he did not particularly require. He had done this occasionally since adolescence, a habit of verbalizing internal calculations, as if the act of speaking them confirmed their validity. I listened. He spoke about the investors, about the timeline he had constructed for the transfer of rights once the inheritance documentation cleared. He spoke about Robert Sterling, a name I recognized from the financial press, a man who ran a private equity operation out of New York that specialized in resource extraction in the American West. He described the terms of the arrangement Sterling had proposed. The percentage structure, the development timeline, the specific legal instrument that would transfer operational control while preserving the nominal attribution of discovery on public-facing documents, which would, Julian noted, make things considerably cleaner from a public relations standpoint. He spoke about my signature on the grant application folder. He called it the foundation document and said it would withstand any initial scrutiny because the language had been drafted by someone who understood how institutional IP transfers were structured and what made them resistant to challenge. He said the only remaining variable was the timeline for the death certificate process, which he had already initiated through the county office, and that once that cleared, the foundation document became the operative instrument, and Sterling's team could begin the permitting process. He said all of this in the same tone a man uses to review a checklist before a presentation. I stopped the recording. The room was very quiet. Outside the parking lot, light threw a rectangle of yellow across the bottom of my curtain and held it there, steady and indifferent. I sat on the edge of the bed with the recorder in my hand and breathed in the careful, deliberate way I had learned in the cave, one breath at a time, each one a small and specific act of will. A knock at the connecting door. One knock, not urgent. I crossed the room and opened it. Silas was sitting in the chair by his window, which he had angled to face the door, the posture of a man who had not been trying to sleep. He was still in his borrowed clothes, a county-issue sweatshirt and work pants, and in the lamplight, he looked considerably less like a man who had spent 3 years underground, and considerably more like someone who had simply been very tired for a long time, and was beginning to remember what rest felt like. "You heard something on that recorder," he said. It was not a question. I had not spoken to him since I entered my room, but he had known anyway, in the way he seemed to know most practical things about a situation, by reading what was available and drawing the accurate conclusion. "Julian was thinking out loud on the drive up," I said. "He did not know I was recording. He discussed the investors, the timeline, the legal instrument, the death certificate process." I looked at the recorder in my hand. He named Robert Sterling specifically. He described the terms of their arrangement in enough detail that a prosecutor would not need to work very hard to establish intent. Silas was quiet for a moment. "How much of it?" 40 minutes of it," I said, "from the first switchback to approximately 2 miles below the trailhead." He looked at the recorder. "Montana is a one-party consent state," he said. "One party to a conversation can legally record it without informing the other party. The recording is admissible." I looked at him. "You know Montana recording law." "I worked search and rescue in this state for 12 years, he said. "Incident documentation. We recorded everything. You learn the rules." I crossed to the chair on my side of the room and sat down. Through the wall, I could hear faintly the sound of a television in another room playing something with a laugh track. The ordinary sounds of a motel at 10 o'clock at night, people watching television, living their quiet and uninterrupted lives. Thomas called while you were in the shower, Silas said. His forensic contact confirmed the video metadata does not match the timestamp. The footage was recorded 4 days before the camping trip, and the timestamp was applied afterward. The alibi is fabricated. I absorbed this without the surge of satisfaction I might have anticipated. What I felt instead was something quieter and more final, the particular sensation of a structure that has been under examination for a long time, revealing its last flaw and becoming definitively unsound. Then tomorrow, I said. Tomorrow, Silas agreed. I turned the recorder over in my hands. 40 minutes of Julian's voice speaking with the calm confidence of a man who believed he was the only person who would ever hear what he was saying, describing in his own words, in his own careful and precise language, exactly what he had done, and why, and what he intended to do next. I pressed play again and found the section I wanted. Julian's voice filled the small room, even and unhurried. By Thursday, the documentation clears automatically. Sterling's team will be at the site by 9. From that point, it's a formality. I stopped it. Silas looked at me across the 2 chairs and the small space between them. He said 9, I said. Thomas said 9, Silas said. Then we need to be there before 9. Silas stood, and in his expression was something I had first seen a flicker of 2 hours ago on a mountain slope, when he said 2 hours in a voice that sounded like hope and which had since then been quietly growing into something more settled and more certain. Get some sleep if you can, he said. Tomorrow asks for everything we have left. He went back through the connecting door and pulled it to, and I sat in the chair with the recorder in my hand, and the curtain throwing its yellow rectangle across the floor, and for the first time in 4 days, I felt something that was not fear, and not grief, and not the cold, mechanical focus of survival. I felt ready. Before I walk out of those trees, and my son sees my face for the first time, I need you to tell me something. Do you think he will run, or will he stand there and keep lying? Type "run" or "lie" in the comments. I want to know what you think before you find out what actually happened. This story carries fictional elements woven in to make the lesson land. Names, places, details coincidental. But what a father learns about blind trust and the people closest to him that is something worth sitting with. We were in position by 8:40. Thomas had driven us up in an unmarked county vehicle, taking the service road that maintenance crews used in the summer months. A rutted track that added 20 minutes to the journey, but kept us well clear of the main trailhead, where Julian's rental and a black SUV with New York plates were already parked when we crested the last rise and pulled into the tree cover. Thomas cut the engine, and we sat for a moment looking down through the pines at the site below. Julian was already talking. He stood at the cleared area in front of the cave entrance, facing a man I placed in his mid-50s tailored jacket, the kind of careful grooming that signals money rather than youth, which was Robert Sterling. 2 other men flanked Sterling, younger, carrying the particular attentive stillness of lawyers or financial advisors in the presence of a transaction. Julian had his hands moving the way they moved when he was presenting, shaping the air around him, building the structure of what he needed people to see. He looked from this distance entirely in command of the situation. Thomas had placed 2 deputies in the tree line on the eastern side, civilian clothes positioned before we arrived. A third was staged further down the service road. Nothing visible. Nothing that would alter what Julian believed about the morning. We wait until he makes a material representation about the discovery or the rights, Thomas said quietly. Something specific, something on record. I watched my son through the tree cover and listened to the faint carry of his voice on the cold morning air, the particular cadence of a prepared presentation, confident and unhurried. He was describing the mineral composition using terminology from my own published papers with the fluency of a man who had studied them carefully. He spoke about the commercial development timeline, about the permitting process, about the arrangement he had structured with Sterling's group. Then he said her name. Eleanor Ridge, he said, would represent the defining resource discovery of the decade in the Northern Rockies. He said my father understood its significance better than anyone. He said honoring that legacy was the only thing that mattered to him now. Thomas looked at me. I opened the car door. The sound of my boots on the gravel was the first thing that reached them. Sterling heard it and turned the instinct of a man who has spent a career reading rooms and knowing when something has entered one. Julian was mid-sentence and kept talking for 2 more words before Sterling's expression stopped him. Julian turned. The distance between us was perhaps 30 feet. I walked it at the pace I used on survey approaches, deliberate and without hurry, because hurrying would have suggested uncertainty, and I had no uncertainty left. His face went through several things very quickly. The blood left it first. Then his mouth opened and closed once the movement of a man whose prepared words have become suddenly and completely inapplicable. Then something else moved behind his eyes, something I recognized from his childhood, the rapid internal calculation of a boy caught in something he could not explain away, looking for the angle that did not exist. He found his voice before I reached him. "Dad." The word came out unsteady, stripped of the performance he had been delivering 60 seconds ago. "You're alive. Thank God," I thought. "I know what you thought," I said. I stopped 4 feet from him and looked at him in the morning light. He was wearing the dark jacket from the television interview, pressed deliberate. His eyes were moving past me to Thomas, to the tree line, back to me, assembling the information, calculating what it meant. Sterling took a step back, not fleeing, simply the instinct of a man creating distance from something he had not been told about. "There's been a misunderstanding," Julian said. His voice had found some of its register again, the professional smoothness returning like a reflex. "The cave-in, you were injured. You don't have a full picture of what happened up here." "I have a complete picture," I said. "I have had 4 days to develop it." I reached into my jacket pocket and took out the field recorder. Julian looked at it. He knew what it was. He had seen me carry one for years. "I recorded field notes on the drive up," I said. "I always do. You were present for the recording. You spoke for approximately 40 minutes. I held his gaze. "Montana law requires only one party's consent for a recording to be admissible. I was that party." The professional smoothness left his face completely. Thomas stepped forward from behind me, badge in hand, and spoke the words that closed the distance between what Julian had planned and what was actually happening on this mountain on this morning. Sterling said something quiet to his lawyers, and they moved toward their vehicle without looking back. Julian stood very still. I looked at my son, at the face I had known since the morning he was born, and felt something that was not triumph and not relief, but something older and quieter than either of those things. The particular exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has finally been permitted to set it down. "Arthur?" Julian's voice had dropped to something almost private, stripped of every layer of performance until what was left was just a man in trouble and the father who was watching it happen. "I needed it to be mine." "I know," I said. Thomas placed a hand on Julian's shoulder, and the morning continued around us, indifferent and clear the way mornings do. They walked Julian to the county vehicle at 9:08. He did not resist. He walked with the careful, contained movement of a man conserving something, dignity perhaps, or the habit of control, right up until the deputy opened the rear door, and he had to lower his head to get in. In that moment, just before the door closed, he looked back at me, not with anger, not with the calculating assessment I had watched move across his face for the past 20 minutes. Something else. Something younger and less composed, the expression of a boy who had broken something irreplaceable and understood finally and too late exactly what he had done. The door closed. I stood at the edge of the cleared area and watched the vehicle move down the service road and disappear into the pines. And I waited to feel something definitive, some clean emotional resolution that matched the clean factual resolution of what had just occurred. It did not come. What came instead was the particular silence of a place that has just finished being the location of something significant and has returned to simply being itself again. Rock and pine and cold air and the faint smell of the mineral deposits that ran beneath everything, indifferent and ancient and unchanged by all of it. Silas came to stand beside me. He did not speak immediately, which was correct. I looked at the cave entrance at the sealed section, where the original opening had been, at the debris that still lay at its base. 4 days ago, I had stood 30 feet inside that opening and believed I was looking at the most significant discovery of my career. I had been right about that. I had simply been wrong about everything that came after. I thought I would feel differently, I said. Silas looked at the cave entrance alongside me. How did you think you would feel? I considered the question honestly. Resolved, I said. I thought there would be a moment where the account balanced, where what was taken was returned and the columns matched. I looked at the sealed entrance, at the debris, at the pale morning light on the rock face. It doesn't work that way. No, Silas said. It doesn't. From down the road, the sound of another vehicle approaching. Thomas returning, or Press, or both. The world reasserting its interest in what had happened up here. I turned away from the cave entrance and looked at Silas. He was standing with his hands at his sides, looking at the mountain range spreading out to the north, the amber and rust of late October running across the ridgeline in the early light. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something he had not yet decided whether to cross. What happens now? He asked. The question was not about Julian or the legal proceedings or the mine rights. I understood that. Now, I said, we go back down. He looked at me. Together, I said. Something shifted in his face. Quietly and without performance, the way the most significant things shift. He picked up his pack. We started down the mountain. 3 weeks later, Silas walked into a courthouse for the first time in 3 years. He wore a borrowed jacket and his own boots, and he carried a folder containing a document he had signed 15 years ago as lead environmental surveyor for the Bitterroot Range assessment. A document that had been filed with the Federal Land Management Office and had been sitting in their archive ever since, patient and precise and waiting. His testimony took 40 minutes. He described the survey, the methodology, the specific safety and environmental standards the assessment had established for any future extraction activity in this range. He described what he had observed inside the cave system over 3 years of continuous habitation. He described the damage to the natural drainage infrastructure, the altered water flow patterns, the structural compromise to the cave entrance. He spoke with the authority of someone who had spent 12 years in professional rescue work and 3 years in the mountain itself, and the court listened the way courts listen when the expertise is undeniable. Julian's permits were revoked before the session ended. Afterward in the hallway, Brenda Croft pressed a folder into my hands. She had driven up from the institute the day after the arrest, had examined my samples personally, and had submitted her own formal verification of the discovery to the academic registry. It's done, she said. Eleanor Ridge, official and permanent. I opened the folder and looked at the registration document. My name, the coordinates, the date of discovery. And at the top of the page, in clean institutional type, the name I had chosen for a woman who had believed the best things in the world were the ones that had been waiting longest to be found. I closed the folder. Down the hallway, Silas was standing at a window looking out at the parking lot, at the ordinary November afternoon beyond it. I walked to where he stood. "How does it feel?" I asked, "being back?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Like something I should have done sooner." Brenda's team was already at the site when we arrived. 3 geologists and a survey technician moving with the purposeful efficiency of people doing work. They understood and believed in setting up equipment at the cleared area in front of the cave entrance. Their voices carrying across the cold November air. In fragments of technical language, I recognized the way you recognize your own handwriting. Silas and I stood at the tree line and watched for a while without going closer. He had shaved. I noticed this in the courthouse parking lot 3 weeks ago and had said nothing, the way you say nothing about the things that matter most, and instead simply register them as evidence of something real. He was wearing a jacket that fit him, purchased from the outfitter in Elkhorn the day after the hearing, and he stood in the November light with his hands in his pockets and looked at the mountain, the way a man looks at something he has been inside and is now seeing from the outside for the first time. "Eleanor would have liked this part," I said. "The team, the work continuing. Not the part before it. She would have had opinions about the part before it," I said. "Very specific ones, delivered at length." I looked at the cave entrance, at the pile of cleared debris at its base, at the pale granite face of the mountain above it. But she would have liked this. People doing careful work in a place that deserved careful work. Silas was quiet for a moment. "Brenda offered me a position," he said. "Field safety assessments for the Institute. Part-time to start." I looked at him. "I said yes," he said. "Yesterday." Something in my chest that had been held carefully in place for a long time released itself quietly and without drama, the way the best things resolve. "Good," I said. We walked down to the site. Brenda looked up when we approached and gave me the nod of a colleague who has completed a task and is satisfied with the result, which was exactly the right acknowledgement, and no more. I introduced Silas, and she shook his hand and said she had read his original survey report, and that his methodology had held up remarkably well for 15 years, which was from Brenda the highest available form of praise. I walked to the cave entrance and stood at its edge. The sealed section had been partially cleared by the investigative team in the weeks since the arrest, enough to confirm the method and document the evidence, not enough to restore the original opening. The mineral vein was visible in the exposed rock face, running dark and rich through the limestone, exactly where my surveys had said it would be. I put my hand against the rock. 4 days ago, from inside this mountain, this stone had been the boundary of everything I knew. Now it was simply geology, ancient and indifferent and full of what it had always contained, waiting, with the patience of things that do not experience time the way the living do. I took my hand away. Silas was standing a few feet behind me. I did not need to look to know. "You found what you came for," he said. I turned around. The Bitterroot Range spread out behind him in the November light, amber and vast and honest, the way Eleanor had always said mountains were honest. Brenda's team moved at the site below us, doing the work. The air was cold and clean and tasted of elevation and pine and the particular mineral sharpness of exposed granite. "I found more than I came for," I said. He looked at me for a moment. Then he turned toward the site, toward Brenda and the work and the ordinary, extraordinary business of continuing, and I turned with him and we walked forward together into whatever came next. I trusted my son completely. I handed him my maps, my research, my life's work, and never once asked what he intended to do with it. That was my failure, not my love for him. The love was real. But love without wisdom is just an open door. If this family story has taught me anything, it is this. Pay attention to what people do, not only what they say. The people who plan to hurt you rarely announce it. They use your trust as their blueprint. I am an old man telling you a family story from the bottom of a mountain I nearly did not come back from. And I will tell you plainly, the way Grandpa's stories are meant to be told without decoration. Do not be like me. Do not sign what you have not read. Do not trust what you have not tested. And do not under any circumstances mistake silence for loyalty. God gave me a second chance in the form of a stranger who had every reason to stay hidden and chose not to. These are the Grandpa stories worth telling. The ones where something true was buried and someone had the courage to dig it up. If this family story moved something in you, leave a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for staying until the end. The stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted for reflection and life lessons. If that is not what you are looking for today, no hard feelings. Step away and find what serves you best. But if you are staying, I am glad you are here.